Picture this. It's a freezing morning in 1400 somewhere in Western Europe. While most people are still warming their hands over their hearths, one craftsman is already at work in his smoky workshop. The sound of his tools echoes through the dawn air, sharp, rhythmic, purposeful. He's not making furniture or weapons or anything you might expect. He's creating something far more essential to medieval life, something that could make the difference between a village thriving or starving through winter. He's making barrels. You might think barrels are just round wooden containers, but you'd be dead wrong. These weren't your backyard rain collectors or decorative flower pots. Medieval barrels were precision instruments of survival, engineered to perfection by craftsmen who understood that one tiny mistake could mean disaster. A leaky barrel meant spoiled wine, ruined grain, or wasted ale. In a world where food preservation could determine whether your family lived or died, the cooper, that's what they called barrel makers, was basically a medieval superhero with wood shavings in his beard. But here's what's really wild about this ancient craft. Everything had to be perfect, not pretty perfect or good enough perfect. We're talking about mathematical precision that would make modern engineers jealous. The slightest gap between wooden staves meant your precious cargo would leak out drop by drop, too much moisture in the wood, and your barrel would fall apart like a house of cards. Too little fire during the bending process, and the wood would crack instead of curve. These coopers had mastered a science that most people today couldn't even begin to understand. If you're finding this fascinating, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, and definitely drop a comment letting me know what you find most interesting about medieval barrel making. I love hearing your thoughts, and it really helps the channel grow. The whole process started with something that seems almost magical when you really think about it. A cooper would look at a massive oak log and somehow see dozens of perfect barrel staves hidden inside. Not just any staves, mind you, but staves that would bend without breaking, seal without gaps, and last for decades of hard use. This wasn't guesswork. It was pure skill developed over years of training that started when most coopers were barely old enough to hold an axe. Oak was the king of barrel wood, and for good reason. This stuff was tougher than most medieval knights and had natural properties that made it perfect for holding liquids. The wood contained something called tannins, natural chemicals that helped preserve whatever was stored inside. Plus, oak had this amazing ability to bend when heated without snapping like a twig. But here's the catch. Not all oak was created equal. The cooper had to select trees that had grown slowly and straight, with grain patterns that would make or break his finished barrels. The first step was splitting, not sawing. Modern woodworkers might scratch their heads at this, but medieval coopers knew something we've almost forgotten. When you split wood along its natural grain lines, you get incredibly strong staves. Saw across those grain lines, and you create weak points that will fail under pressure. So these craftsmen would take their wedges and mallets and carefully split each log into rough stave blanks, reading the wood grain like a book written in growth rings. But splitting was just the beginning of a process that would test both patience and skill. Those rough stave blanks needed to season, basically dry out slowly and evenly, for months, or sometimes even years. Too fast, and the wood would warp and crack. Too slow, and you'd be waiting forever while your customers went elsewhere for their barrels. Smart coopers had stacks of seasoning wood in various stages, like a medieval assembly line that moved at the speed of nature. The seasoning process was pure science disguised as simple waiting. Wood needed to lose just the right amount of moisture, enough to become stable and workable, but not so much that it became brittle. Coopers would stack their staves with small spaces between them, allowing air to circulate while protecting the wood from rain and direct sunlight. Some craftsmen claimed they could tell just by looking at a stave whether it had seasoned properly. Others would tap the wood with their knuckles, listening for that perfect sound that meant the moisture content was just right. Once the staves were properly seasoned, the real artistry began. Each stave had to be shaped with incredible precision, using tools that would make modern woodworkers weep with envy. The jointer, basically a massive wooden plane, would shave each stave to exactly the right thickness. But that was just the start. Each stave needed to be beveled along its edges so it would fit perfectly against its neighbours. We're talking about angles measured not in degrees but in tiny fractions that could only be achieved through years of experience and an almost supernatural feel for wood. The beveling process was where good coopers separated themselves from great ones. Too shallow an angle, and you'd get gaps that would leak. Too steep, and the staves wouldn't hold together properly. The cooper would work each edge with his draw knife, taking whisper-thin shavings until the angle was perfect. Some master coopers could bevel a stave so precisely that when two edges were pressed together, you couldn't slide a piece of parchment between them. With perfectly shaped staves ready came one of the most dramatic parts of the entire process: raising the cask. This wasn't just assembly. It was controlled chaos that required timing, strength, and more than a little faith in your own abilities. The cooper would arrange his staves in a circle, held together by temporary hoops made of hazel or willow. These weren't the permanent iron hoops that would eventually hold everything together. They were more like a wooden corset, keeping things in place just long enough to work some medieval magic. Here's where things got really interesting. The cooper would take his partially assembled barrel, looking more like a wooden flower at this point, and bring it over to his fire. Not a roaring bonfire, but a carefully controlled flame that would create just the right amount of heat and steam. Too much fire, and you'd char the wood; too little, and the staves wouldn't bend properly. The heat would make the wood fibers relax and become pliable, while the steam added just enough moisture to prevent cracking. The bending process was like watching a wooden sculpture come to life. As the heat worked its magic, the cooper would gradually tighten those temporary hoops, coaxing the staves into their classic barrel shape. The straight wooden planks would slowly curve inward, creating that distinctive bulge in the middle called the bilge. This wasn't just for looks. That curved shape was engineered perfection. It distributed stress evenly and made the barrel incredibly strong, while also making it easy to roll. But getting the shape right was only half the battle. Those temporary hoops were just holding things together temporarily. The real strength would come from the permanent iron hoops that would be driven down over the wood with enough force to lock everything in place forever. The iron hoops were where the cooper's strength really mattered. These weren't delicate jewellery pieces. They were thick bands of wrought iron that had to be forced down over the wooden staves with enough pressure to compress everything into a watertight seal. The cooper would start with the largest hoop, called the bilge hoop, which went around the widest part of the barrel. Using his hoop driver, basically a heavy iron tool with a curved edge, he'd pound that hoop down inch by inch, working his way around the barrel in a steady rhythm. You could hear a good cooper working from 3 streets away. Bang, bang, bang. Each strike perfectly placed, each impact driving the iron just a little bit further down the wooden staves. Too gentle, and the hoop wouldn't compress the wood enough to create a proper seal. Too aggressive, and you'd split a stave and ruin hours of work. The sound itself told the whole story. A sharp, clean ring meant the wood was compressing properly. A dull thud meant trouble. Either the wood was too soft, or the hoop wasn't sitting right. After the bilge hoop came the quarter hoops, positioned about halfway between the centre and each end of the barrel. These helped distribute the stress and kept the barrel's shape stable under pressure. Finally came the chime hoops at the very ends, which were smaller but just as important. Each hoop had to be driven down with mathematical precision. Too loose, and your barrel would leak. Too tight, and the wood might crack under the pressure. But even with all the hoops in place, the barrel was still just an open wooden tube. That's where the crows came in, a specialized tool that cut a groove around the inside of each barrel end. This groove, called the crow's groove, would hold the circular wooden ends that would actually seal the barrel shut. Cutting this groove was like performing surgery with medieval tools. One slip, one groove that was too deep or angled wrong, and you'd have to start over with new staves. The croze itself looked like something between a plane and a compass, with a sharp cutting edge that could carve a perfectly circular groove in one continuous motion. The cooper would work slowly and steadily, shaving away tiny curls of wood until the groove was exactly the right depth and width. Some master coopers could cut a croze groove so perfectly that the barrel head would slide in with just finger pressure, yet seal so tightly that not even air could escape. Making the barrel heads was its own specialized art. These weren't just flat circles of wood, they were engineered panels made from several pieces of wood joined together with incredible precision. Each head started with carefully selected boards that were jointed edge to edge, creating a flat panel slightly larger than the barrel's opening. The cooper would then use his compass, a tool with two curved arms, to scribe a perfect circle on the panel. Cutting that circle required steady hands and sharp tools. The cooper would use his heading knife to carefully trim away the excess wood, leaving a perfectly round disc. But that wasn't enough. The edge of each head had to be beveled to match the angle of the croze groove. Too steep, and the head wouldn't sit properly. Too shallow, and it wouldn't seal. Getting this angle perfect required the kind of skill that took decades to develop. Here's where things got really clever. The best coopers would create what they called a tongue around the edge of each head, a raised ridge that would fit into the croze groove like a key in a lock. This tongue had to be cut with incredible precision using a tool called a heading swift, which could shave the thinnest possible curls of wood from the head's edge. The finished tongue would be slightly oversized, so when it was forced into the groove, it would compress and create an even tighter seal. Testing a finished barrel was where the cooper's reputation was made or broken. For wet cooperage, barrels meant to hold liquids. The test was brutal in its simplicity. Fill the barrel with water and wait. Any leak, no matter how small, meant the barrel was a failure. The cooper would roll his finished barrel over to the testing area and carefully fill it with hot water, which would make the wood swell and reveal any imperfections in the joints. A properly made barrel would swell tight within minutes, the hot water causing the wood fibers to expand and press against each other with tremendous force. The cooper would check every seam, every joint, looking for the telltale signs of moisture that meant a leak. If he found one, there was no easy fix. Sometimes he could drive the hoops tighter or pack additional material into a gap, but often it meant starting over with new staves. The different types of barrels required different approaches. Dry cooperage for storing grain or flour didn't need to be completely watertight, so these barrels could be made with lighter hoops and less precise joints. Wet cooperage for ale, wine, or spirits needed to be absolutely perfect. One tiny leak could ruin an entire batch of expensive liquid. Some barrels for specific purposes got special treatments. Wine barrels might be toasted on the inside to add flavour, while barrels for storing pitch or tar might be lined with additional waterproofing. Each finished barrel got its maker's mark burned into the wood with a branding iron. This wasn't just decoration. It was a guarantee of quality and a way to track which cooper had made which barrel. A cooper's reputation travelled with every barrel he made, and in medieval times, reputation was everything. One bad barrel could ruin years of careful relationship building with merchants and customers. The final test was the roll test. A properly made barrel should roll true on its bilge, moving in a straight line without wobbling or favouring one side. The cooper would give his finished barrel a gentle push and watch it roll across his workshop floor. Any deviation from a straight line meant the barrel was out of round, a flaw that would make it difficult to transport and stack. The numbers behind medieval coopering tell a story that would make modern efficiency experts weep with envy and frustration all at once. A typical barrel required somewhere between 24 and 30 staves, depending on its size and intended use. That might not sound like much until you realize that each of those staves had to be individually shaped beveled and fitted with tolerances that would challenge modern machinery. One master cooper, working with 2 skilled apprentices, could finish maybe 3 or 4 medium-sized barrels in a full day's work, assuming everything went perfectly, which it rarely did. But here's what really shows the incredible skill involved. Those same 3 craftsmen might spend an entire week on a single large wine cask meant for a monastery or wealthy merchant. These weren't just bigger barrels, they were engineering marvels that could hold hundreds of gallons while remaining completely watertight for decades. The largest barrels ever made in medieval workshops could hold over 1,000 gallons and required teams of coopers working together like a medieval NASCAR pit crew. The hoop count varied dramatically based on the barrel's purpose and size. A small ale barrel might get by with 6 iron hoops, while a massive storage cask could need 10 or more. Each hoop had to be forged by the local blacksmith to exact specifications, heated cherry red and shaped on the anvil while the iron was still soft. The relationship between cooper and blacksmith was crucial. One trade couldn't survive without the other, and smart coopers cultivated their blacksmith relationships like precious friendships. What made this whole process even more impressive was the complete lack of standardization. There were no universal measurements, no factory specifications, no quality control departments. Every cooper developed his own techniques, his own tool preferences, his own secret tricks for getting the wood to behave exactly right. Some swore by seasoning their staves for exactly 18 months. Others insisted that 24 months was the minimum. A few claimed they could make better barrels using wood that had been struck by lightning, though that was probably more superstition than science. The firework was where individual cooper personalities really showed through. Some liked hot, fast flames that would bend the staves quickly. Others preferred slow, gentle heat that took longer but gave them more control over the bending process. The smell of a cooper's workshop was distinctive, a mixture of wood smoke, wet oak, and that particular scent that comes from wood being forced into new shapes. People could identify a working coopery from blocks away just by the smell. Temperature control during the bending process was purely intuitive. There were no thermometers, no precise measurements, just years of experience and the ability to read wood like a book. A master cooper could tell just by looking at his staves whether they were ready to bend or needed more heat. Too much steam and the wood would become soggy and weak. Too little and it would crack like a dry twig when pressure was applied. The most dangerous part of the entire process wasn't the fire or the heavy tools. It was the moment when those iron hoops were being driven home. All that stored energy in the compressed wood could explode outward if something went wrong. Hoops could snap under pressure, sending sharp metal fragments flying across the workshop. Staves could split suddenly, turning hours of careful work into kindling in the blink of an eye. Smart coopers developed an almost supernatural sense for when wood was about to fail, backing away from barrels that sounded or felt wrong. Winter coopering was its own special challenge. The wood behaved differently in cold weather, becoming more brittle and harder to work. The fire that was essential for bending staves also had to heat the entire workshop, creating a constant battle between staying warm and not overheating the wood. Some coopers would actually move their workshops closer to their houses during the coldest months, working by candlelight and firelight when the days became too short for proper woodworking. But it was the spring rush that really tested a cooper's skills and sanity. As soon as the weather warmed up, everyone needed barrels all at once. Farmers needed containers for storing their grain harvests. Brewers needed fresh casks for their spring ale batches. Merchants needed barrels for shipping goods that had been waiting all winter for navigable roads. A cooper who couldn't keep up with spring demand would lose customers to competitors who could work faster or had planned better. The apprenticeship system for coopers was notoriously demanding, even by medieval standards. Most boys started around age 12 or 13, beginning with the most basic tasks like sorting wood and maintaining tools. They'd spend years just learning to recognize good wood from bad, understanding grain patterns, and developing the muscle memory needed to work with hand tools for hours at a time. Many apprentices never made it past the wood preparation stage. They'd either lack the patience for the precise work or discover they didn't have the physical strength needed for driving hoops. The tool collection of a master cooper was worth more than most people's entire possessions. A complete set of coopering tools could cost as much as a small house, and many of these tools were custom made for their individual owners. The draw knife had to fit the cooper's hands perfectly. The compass had to be adjusted to his preferred barrel proportions. Even the mallets were personalized. Some coopers preferred light, quick strikes, while others liked heavy hammers that could drive hoops home with fewer blows. Sharpening and maintaining these tools was a daily ritual that bordered on religious ceremony. A dull draw knife was worse than useless. It would tear the wood instead of cutting cleanly, ruining staves that had taken months to prepare properly. The whetstones used for sharpening were often passed down through generations of coopers, developing their own personalities and characteristics through years of use. Some master coopers claimed they could sharpen their tools in complete darkness, relying entirely on the feel of steel against stone. Quality control in medieval coopering was ruthless and immediate. A barrel that leaked during testing couldn't be patched up and sold as a slightly imperfect product. It was either completely rebuilt or broken down for scrapwood. There was no middle ground, no second-quality market. This harsh reality meant that coopers developed an obsessive attention to detail that bordered on paranoia. They'd check and recheck every joint, every bevel, every angle multiple times throughout the construction process. The seasonal wood selection process was like a medieval version of wine tasting. Coopers would walk through forests with the intensity of modern sommeliers, examining bark patterns, testing wood density, even smelling the sawdust from test cuts to determine which trees would make the best staves. Oak trees that grew too fast produced wood that was too porous. Trees that grew too slowly might be too dense and difficult to work. The perfect tree had grown at just the right speed, in just the right conditions, and had been cut at just the right time of year. Some coopers developed reputations for specific types of barrels. There were ale specialists who understood the unique requirements for beer storage. Wine coopers who knew how different grape varieties affected wood selection. Even specialized coopers who made nothing but barrels for storing saltfish or pickled vegetables. Each specialty required its own knowledge base, its own techniques, its own trade secrets that were guarded more carefully than royal treasures. The economic impact of a skilled cooper on his community was enormous. A village with a good cooper could preserve food more effectively, trade more efficiently, and survive bad harvests that might devastate neighboring communities. Coopers were often among the wealthiest craftsmen in their towns, commanding prices that reflected the critical importance of their work. A master cooper's workshop was frequently one of the largest buildings in a village, housing not just the craftsman and his apprentices, but also serving as a community gathering place where important business was conducted. But the real measure of a cooper's skill wasn't in the workshop, it was on the road. Barrels had to survive being loaded onto carts, bounced over rutted medieval roads, stacked in ship holds during stormy crossings, and handled by dock workers who weren't always gentle with other people's property. A barrel that split during transport didn't just mean lost cargo, it could mean the difference between a successful trading venture and financial ruin. The testing process for finished barrels was both art and science. Beyond the basic water test, experienced coopers had developed dozens of ways to evaluate their work. They'd listen to the sound when hoops were tapped with a mallet. A clear ring meant tight joints, while a dull thud suggested problems. They'd check the flexibility by pressing on the staves to see if they gave the right amount under pressure. Some even had special tools for measuring the internal dimensions to ensure the barrel would hold exactly the amount of liquid it was supposed to contain. Transportation of finished barrels created its own challenges and opportunities. Empty barrels could be nested inside each other for efficient shipping, But this required precise construction, so they'd fit together properly without jamming. Full barrels had to be designed to stack securely without crushing the ones beneath them. The art of barrel rolling, moving heavy casks by tilting them on their bilge and rolling them along the ground, was a skill that dock workers and warehouse men had to master to avoid damaging the carefully crafted containers. Regional variations in coopering techniques reflected local wood availability, climate conditions, and cultural preferences. Northern European coopers working with harder woods developed different tool designs than their Mediterranean counterparts who had access to different tree species. English coopers became famous for their ale barrels, while French craftsmen specialized in wine casks that could age spirits for decades without affecting the flavor. The guild system that governed medieval crafts was particularly strong among coopers, who understood that maintaining quality standards protected everyone's livelihood. Guild regulations specified everything from apprenticeship requirements to wood quality standards to pricing structures. Violating guild rules could result in fines, loss of trading privileges, or even banishment from the craft entirely. These weren't just bureaucratic rules. They were survival mechanisms for an industry where reputation meant everything. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about medieval coopering was how these craftsmen managed to create such precise, durable products, using nothing but hand tools, experience, and an almost mystical understanding of wood behavior. Every barrel that rolled out of a medieval workshop represented hundreds of hours of skilled labor, decades of accumulated knowledge, and a level of craftsmanship that we're still trying to replicate with modern machinery. The finishing touches on a medieval barrel revealed the cooper's true mastery. After all the bending, hooping, and fitting came the moment of truth, sealing that final head into place. This wasn't just sliding a wooden disc into a groove and calling it done. The cooper had to judge exactly how much pressure to apply, how far to drive that last chime hoop, and when to stop before the wood split under the strain. Here's where things got really interesting. Different cargoes demanded completely different approaches to the final sealing process. A barrel meant for dry grain storage could handle a looser fit, since a few escaping kernels wouldn't spell disaster. But a cask destined to hold precious wine or ale needed to be sealed tighter than a miser's purse. One tiny gap could turn expensive liquid into expensive vinegar faster than you could say, spoiled vintage. The toasting process for certain barrels was like watching controlled arson performed by an artist. Wine barrels got a light toasting that would add subtle flavors to whatever aged inside them. The cooper would rotate the barrel slowly over glowing coals, listening for the soft, crackling sound that meant the wood was caramelizing just right. Too much heat, and you'd char the inside like a burnt dinner. Too little, and the toasting wouldn't penetrate deep enough to matter. Some barrels destined for storing pitch or tar got lined with additional materials, strips of specially prepared leather, or even thin sheets of metal hammered smooth and fitted like a second skin inside the wood. This lining process required tools that most coopers had to make themselves, since no two barrels were exactly alike, and standard fittings simply didn't exist. Or the branding process was where a cooper literally burned his reputation into every piece of work. Those iron brands weren't just heated in any fire. They had to reach exactly the right temperature to create a clean, deep mark without scorching the surrounding wood. Some master coopers developed elaborate branding symbols that became as recognizable as royal seals, marking their barrels with designs that customers could spot from across a busy marketplace. But the real test of a finished barrel wasn't what happened in the workshop. It was what happened during its first real journey. Loading a brand new cask onto a merchant's cart was like sending your child off to their first day of school. You'd done everything you could to prepare them, but now they had to survive in the real world, where roads were rutted nightmares and cart drivers weren't always gentle with their cargo. The rolling test wasn't just about making sure the barrel moved in a straight line. A truly well-made cask would roll with a specific rhythm, maintaining its momentum without wobbling or favouring one side. Experienced merchants could actually hear the quality of a barrel just by listening to it roll across cobblestones. A perfect barrel made a deep, resonant sound as it moved. A poorly made one would produce irregular thumps and scrapes that announced its flaws to anyone within earshot. Storage of finished barrels created its own logistical puzzles. Empty casks needed to be kept in conditions that prevented the wood from drying out too much or absorbing excess moisture from the air. Too dry, and the staves would shrink, and the barrel would fall apart when first filled. Too damp, and mould would start growing in places where it couldn't be cleaned out. Smart coopers developed storage systems that kept their finished products in perfect condition until customers arrived to collect them. The next time you see a modern barrel, whether it's holding whiskey in a distillery or sitting as decoration in someone's backyard, remember that you're looking at the descendant of medieval engineering that would put most modern manufacturing to shame. Those anonymous craftsmen working by firelight in their smoky workshops didn't just make containers. They created the foundation of global trade, the backbone of food preservation, and the difference between civilization and chaos. Every perfect joint, every precisely driven hoop, every flawlessly cut groove represented knowledge that took lifetimes to master and could never be fully replaced by machines. In a world where we throw away broken things and buy new ones, these medieval masters built objects designed to outlast the people who made them. That's not just craftsmanship, that's immortality carved from oak and sealed with fire.